Hello, everybody. You're very welcome. I hope that you can all see and hear me. My name is Eddie Rich. I'm the CEO of the International Hydropower Association, but today I'm actually wearing a different hat. I'm wearing my hat as the chair of the REN Alliance. I think we all know why we're here today. There's been a lot of coverage recently about the near-term challenges that we all face from recovering from COVID-19 in health terms, but also in jobs and economic growth, and how to marry that with the ongoing challenges of climate change. There are so many calls out there at the moment for green stimulus packages. The world is looking at renewables and they are expecting things from us. Can everybody make sure they're on mute? Thank you. So the world is looking at renewables and we are obviously responding, and we need to stand together. We need to stand together to demonstrate that we are more together than we are individually, and that maximizes our effectiveness. To me, today is not a question of if renewables can work together. We are going to be discussing how that's going to happen and how we are going to respond to these stimulus packages. We've got a very impressive panel of speakers that represent all the major renewable energies at the global level. There are a slew of up-to-date status and action reports that are responding to these challenges. And on top of that, we've only got 75 minutes. So this is going to have to be a fast-paced event. If you just move on to the next slide, I think you all know how this thing works these days. We've all been on enough of these webinars. If you have questions, if you have comments, please put them in the chat box and we will try to pick up on them after the presentations. Next slide. Let me start by trying to set out the general picture of where we are in the wake of COVID-19. You have all seen these kind of graphs before, that we are looking at this year an 8% drop in global CO2 emissions. That takes us back to where we were 10 years ago. This is the biggest single annual drop in history. The emissions drop is largely explained, 86% of it are from transport, from power and from industry. And we all know how it went in the previous crises. We know how it went in the 70s and 80s with the oil shocks, with the financial crisis after in last decade. What happened was that as soon as the crisis was over, the global emissions went back up to the previous trajectory. It bounced back on fossil fuels. And yesterday, I was looking at some quite worrying data coming in from China, suggesting that a similar kind of post-lockdown might happen. Look, we obviously must avoid a return to the old normal. The restart button must look different this time. And a second point I want to make on this graph is, I don't want to be too dismal, but here we are talking about an 8% drop in a year where we have had a huge lockdown. The economy has stopped in many places across the world for large parts of the year. And yet last year, the UN agreed that we needed a 7.6 annual reduction every single year, 7.6%. Every year until 2030, if we're going to hold the global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So it shows that unless we're going to stop the economy every year, something structural really needs to happen. Can I have the next slide? So this slide shows some modelling by Climate Action Tracker, and I think you've seen similar ones where you have growth models, an optimistic scenario and a pessimistic scenario, and what the scenario was before. If we move on to the next slide, what this is then laid onto, you have those growth scenarios and 5 different responses to COVID. So we could go back to a fossil fuel rebound, as I was describing happened before previous crisis. Second scenario, we return to the policies we had before COVID. Thirdly, some kind of weak green stimulus packages. Fourthly, moderate green stimulus packages. And fifthly, a strong green stimulus response. Now, this is the key point. If you don't remember anything else I say, try and remember this. This is, if we want to reduce emissions, there is no point in hoping and relying on low growth. That's not going to do it. This shows that you're better off with much higher growth, but a really green energy stimulus, infrastructure investments, including energy efficiency and low carbon energy supply technologies. With a strong green stimulus, that is a much better way to ensure both growth and the reduction of emissions. So this is why today I think you're going to hear a lot about structural change. You're going to hear a lot about what needs to be done in the markets, about policy frameworks. Make no mistake, this is a matter of political will and choice. So how is that going to look? Let me first of all turn to Rana Adib, who is the Executive Director of REN21. I think most of you know REN21 is the Renewable Energy Policy Network for the 21st century. It's a mixture of industry associations like ours and also NGOs and international organizations, and it's based in UNEP in Paris. You just produced, I think, Rana, the Renewables Global Status Report. So you'll be talking about that and some other things that you think are necessary for us as the renewable sectors working together. So thank you, Rana. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Eddie. Hello, everybody. I'm very excited actually to be here because we don't have so often webinars and the space to discuss how the different renewable energy sectors work together to make the overall transition towards an efficient and renewable energy space working, system working. So on the next slide, so Eddie, you have already said like what renewable and REN21 is. So we're the only global community of players that bring together governments, intergovernmental organizations, industry associations, industry and science and academia. And I think that all panelists actually here are a member of REN21. What we're doing is really to make the shift to renewables happen now by producing collaborative knowledge. We always speak about ourselves as an octopus with the decentralized energy of our community. And using this knowledge, the data, facts to inform and influence decisions and decision makers. Next slide, please. I'm not going to bore you on explaining you the Renewables 2020 Global Status Report, but I think it's important to remind us, even if in COVID time, that it is important to step back and look at where we stay. And we just launched the Renewables Global Status Report, which is covering all energy sectors, all renewable energy technologies, energy efficiency, and we also have a specific feature on public support for renewables. And I invite you to go into that. What is important, I think, is to remind ourselves that renewables is not only renewables. Renewables is clean air and a healthy environment. It's fewer CO2 emissions, And especially in COVID times, it's economic opportunities and decent jobs. For developing countries, affordable and inclusive energy, but also energy security and sovereignty. And that is important if we are really serious about embarking not only energy players, but other sectors in the transition. Next slide, please. So where do we stand in 2019? I think there are really great announcements again. A record of 200 gigawatt of renewable power has been added in 2019, mainly driven by solar PV and wind power, and clearly driven by the fact that renewable energy today is basically a no-brainer because it's almost everywhere the least cost option. On the next slide, you'll see that as a result, renewable energy is not only a matter of some key countries anymore, but it's a global development. When we're looking at solar PV and wind power, they are spreading around the world, and we have more than 47 countries in 2019 that have more than 1 gigawatt of solar PV and wind installed. On the next slide, we'll see, however, that even though there is an economic opportunity, and obviously the investment is, so for €1 invested, you'll have more installed capacities, but considering the importance of the magnitude of the challenge ahead to address climate change and sustainable development, obviously a curve where the investment in renewable power and fuels is almost stagnating is not ideal. And it's even worse when we're looking at the overall energy system, because renewable power, where we have the most advancements, here we have a share of 26.4% of renewables that are covering the power demand, but power only represents 17% of the overall energy demand. The bulk is for heating, cooling, and transport, and here you see that we only have a share of 10.1% in heating and 3.3% of transport. And on the next slide, you'll basically see the reason for it. And this is clearly, and Eddie, you have mentioned it, we need policy intention. There needs to be political will. Here on the slide, you see the development of regulatory policies in the power sector, 143 countries, and you see there is a steep uptake. In transport, only 70 countries have regulatory policies, and in heating and cooling, 23. And the worst message on this, it's not going up. Very clearly, we need to have the same policy attention, targets, regulative frameworks to develop the markets, drive innovation, bring down costs to make the transition happen everywhere. And I think this is basically where the panel here is really interesting, because we're covering the different technologies which allow us to not only focus on the power sector, but also on other sectors. And it's really time to move in that direction. On the next slide, you'll see how critical the situation is. The orange bars is the energy development, so the energy demand. The gray bar is fossil fuel, and the yellow bar is modern renewables. And you'll see that even though the growth rate of renewables is impressive, plus 21.5% in 5 years' time compared to 5.7 on fossil fuel, it's a minimum part. And that is just something which is really important to keep in mind and needs to translate into policy ambition. And on the next slide, we'll see that today it's not enough to ask for support for renewable energy. We clearly need to bring down the energy demand, so energy saving and energy efficiency, but it's also fundamental to phase out fossil fuels. And in this context, I feel that it's also important, and in the economic recovery packages, we see the discussions, obviously. There is a short-term tension on jobs, on economic losses of sectors. So what needs to happen today by the governments is clearly leadership to accompany these sectors also to engage in the transition towards an efficient and renewable energy-based system on the production side, but also on the demand side. So it's very clear that for a systemic problem, we need a systemic solution and many players working together. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rana. Some very clear, strong messages. The investments in renewables is not growing fast enough. We're not changing the mix fast enough. This isn't just about energy, it's about the whole economy, but also some promising stuff about what is transitioning. Thank you. Picking up on some of those ideas and extending them, let me turn to Dr. Roland Roche. Roland is the Deputy Director at the Innovation and Technology Centre of IRENA. IRENA, as you all know, is the International Renewable Energy Agency. Roland leads on their work on renewable energy innovation, grid assessments, and the strategies for power sector transformation. And like REN21, IRENA also has just produced a new study, brought out its post-COVID recovery agenda. That will be part of what Roland is covering in this talk. So over to you, Roland. Oh, sorry, just before you do, please do remember, everybody, if you have questions or comments, keep them coming in the chat box. Thanks. Roland.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Eddie, for the opportunity here to present the IRENA post-COVID recovery agenda for resilience, development, and equality, our report, which we just launched 2 weeks ago. I do this presentation here on behalf of the International Renewable Energy Agency, which is a governmental organization with 161 member countries and 30 countries in a session. And we have the objective to accelerate the deployment of renewable energies. And in this sense, I would start with a statement. So while we know energy is central to all economic activity, our current energy system is unfit for the stable, resilient, and climate-safe world that all wants to live in. And the energy system we need is within our grasp. So let's say now to accelerate, because of the COVID crisis, the investment into renewable energy is here yet the option in response to the current health and economic crisis, where governments have announced now additional $1 trillion of a stimulus package. We see that energy is not really often prioritized in this recovery packages, and that's why we took the action to present the report here. The report, the post-COVID recovery report, is based on IRENA's global renewable energy outlook. And what we in principle do, and that makes actually our work here very coherent and distinct, it is that the recovery options that we have, that we will outline here in the post-COVID recovery report, are based on IRENA's long-term pathways towards a 1.5-degree future. So what we did in principle, we working back and we shortened the time for the renewable energy investments to achieve the objective of the Paris Agreement to stabilize the global temperature at 1.5 degrees. So that really supports this report here. What you see, and this is now the first slide from the report. So the last slide again, the last slide. Yes. So what you see here, we estimate that $2 trillion of energy transformation investment is needed each year in the recovery phase between 2021 and 2023. So this is more than double as the $825 billion that have been invested in 2019. And this constitutes to $6 trillion, of which $3 trillion would go into energy efficiency and $3 trillion would go into renewable energies, and it would go there into direct investment into renewables of 1.5 trillion, and then also in electrification and infrastructure of 1.3 trillion, and it would go into innovation investments into innovation of $0.1 trillion. The next slide, please. So what these additional investments, what would be achieved in this phase from 2020 to 2023? So the increase in the speed of the energy transformation, as I explained, we in principle accelerate the energy sector transformation and we achieve the objectives we have planned for the GROW report somehow earlier. And this brings immediate job creation benefits, a much needed boost in these times of economic uncertainty. So IRENA is already since 7 years tracking the jobs creation in the renewable energy sector, and in principle have the jobs in the past 7 years doubled to 11 million now. And what we see here is very important. By 2023, the investment we have outlined, so the $6 trillion will have created an additional 5.5 million jobs. And let's say with the sum, to measure with the sum, in principle, we see that each $1 million that is invested into renewable energy will create 25 jobs. And the investments that go into energy efficiency, so 1 million investment into energy efficiency will create another 10 jobs. So next slide. And I think this is a very positive prospection of what will happen with this accelerated energy sector transformation. But there are, of course, important policy measures that are elaborated in the report, which I would briefly like to mention. So the number one ambition is here to raise national targets and enhance NDC growth. Then also the public intervention is very important. So steer investment away from fossil fuels and make bailouts condition on climate action. Then number three, safeguard existing renewable projects and then ensure a stable policy framework for transition into the related and needed infrastructure. Number four is here related to the employment, supports the workforce expansion in energy transition related fields and develop training and education to minimize the gaps and skills gaps and reskill workers from the fossil industry to be able and capable to work in renewable energies and energy efficiency. Number five is related to industry, diversify supply chains and develop local industry that support the energy sector transformation. And last but not least, number six is access, support the distributed renewable energy solution to strengthen health, sanitation, and other critical infrastructure. Thanks a lot for having me here and for this presentation. Thanks a lot. Over to Eddie.
Thank you, Roland. Thank you. Excellent. Look, some very clear, strong messages on employment, on calls to action. Again, emphasising that point that the jobs and growth from investment in renewables is stronger than in other non-renewable energy sources. Let me turn to our friend Paolo Franco. Next, he's the head of the Renewable Energy Division at the International Energy Agency. Look, you all know the International Energy Agency. You guys have been producing countless reports since the beginning of COVID on updates on the energy sector, including the report out less than 2 weeks ago on the Sustainable Recovery Plan for the next 3 years. So look forward to hearing about that and other views. Paolo, thank you.
Thank you, Eddie. I understand that I'm still struggling with my webcam, but it doesn't matter. Well, let's follow the slides. Indeed, thank you for. Can you hear me well? Oh, you can see me. Yes. Fantastic. So it's only me that I cannot monitor myself. So I have to be very careful.
Looking very handsome.
Good. Very good. Now, thank you indeed for giving us the opportunity to share our views on the COVID and post-COVID. And I will actually split the thing in two. The first is a kind of damage assessment. what we think are the impacts of the COVID crisis on the renewable sector and more in general. And the second is the recovery plan that we published some time ago. Next slide. Now, the first is the impact. And I have to say immediately, this is only the power sector, which is depicted here. I summarizing halting, but not halting the renewables growth. First, as Rana said correctly, 2019 was a record year of additions. And before the crisis, 2020 was set to be another total record year for renewables. And then the crisis come. And what we think is that there will be a decline of new additions in 2020 around minus 13%. This is the first time in 2 decades that this happens. But given the fact that most of the projects are rather delayed and not cancelled, and that there will be still continuing policy support, we think there will be a rebound in 2021. I should note that the renewable power sector is more resilient than other sectors, including fossil fuels, but I should also note that the renewable heat and renewable transport, which already are too low, as Rana correctly said, they were and they are going to be hit very hard. Next. Now, in terms of electricity technology, we see different behaviors. We see wind recovering in 2021, utility scale PV also recovering, and then, however, a big problem with rooftop PV. And this is because we observe that the COVID-19 is exacerbating existing challenges, and of course, it is hitting hard households and small and medium enterprises and hitting hard their willingness to invest. Even if they have money, in this moment, they keep the money for themselves. Hydropower is another story, but actually it gives a big hand to the rebound of renewables, but this is the consequence of much longer lead times, investment plans. This is also the consequence of 2 giant projects coming online in China. What is important and what is in line what the others have already said, no, still the previous one, please, is that despite the fact that costs are going down, and for instance, we have an unprecedented overcapacity in PV, this will not shelter the renewables from a number of market risks. Less demand, less lower prices, and in some cases, ultra low prices of fossil fuels, notably gas. So I concur with what the other said. The role of government is more important than ever. Next one. Now, at the same time, it is important to put this in a context, because this crisis is bringing this year a total unprecedented decline in energy investment of minus 20%. This is all sectors, not just electricity. What is particularly worrying for the renewables is the decrease of investment in grids, which was already not enough before to go for Paris Agreement scenarios, and it is particularly worrying. If you compare this with renewables investment decrease, renewables only decreasing just for 10%, so much less. And once again, this says the renewables are more resilient, but they're suffering a lot, and the decline in networks and grids is particularly worrying. And then let's come to the recovery plan. First, next one, please. Yes. First, the IEA was the first international organization, or still in March, to be very clear and vocal on the need to put the clean energy transitions at the center of the recoveries. And on the 18th of June, we published our Sustainable Recovery Plan, which is a plan of $1 trillion for 3 years. It covers 30 measures all across the whole energy spectrum, all fuels, all technologies, including also demand. Basically, it brings up millions of jobs, a faster growth of GDP by 1.1%. This analysis was done together with IMF, and it will be substantial reduce emissions. Regarding the jobs, which is in this graph, we estimate 6 million permanent job losses because of the crisis, but then a rebound, and no surprise, the first sector which rebounds is the buildings, because building renovation programs which can support both energy efficiency and renewables at the same time, they are very good in terms of revamping the economy and creating jobs quickly. But the second is the best is precisely solar and wind, which has a number of additional million jobs per year, would represent an investment opportunity of almost $200 billion per year on average, and bring additional capacities in the order of more than 100 gigawatts per year. So a phenomenal boost to the renewables if this recovery plan was applied. And next, my last slide. First of all, if we had no recovery plan, we believe that unfortunately we would see a rebound of emissions. This is the without a sustainable recovery, precisely as it happened back in 2010. Please remind that back then in 2009 the emissions dropped, and in 2010 they increased by a factor 4 respect to 2009. With a sustainable recovery plan, we could go down to a 4.5 gigatons of annual emissions in 2023, and most importantly, that would bring 2019 as the ultimate definitive year of peak emissions globally, which would put the world more on a sustainable pattern towards the Paris Agreement. So to conclude, we believe a sustainable recovery is at the reach of the world if we act quickly. And who is we? We stress that the role of governments is more important than ever, not necessarily to put money, but to simplify procedures and to get the right guarantees to the renewable energy sector to develop. Thank you very much for your attention.
Sorry,
hello?
I was struggling with my my mute button. Very common declaration in these times. Thank you, Paolo. Very important messages. I think that they reinforce what we've heard, this strong call to governments. That there is a moment just now that renewables are a resilient way to recover from this crisis, and there are jobs which can be recovered pretty quickly. Let me turn now with the next slide. Thanking our outside speakers, we will now turn a bit more to the alliance of the industry associations from renewables themselves. And as you can see, we have geothermal, we have solar, we have bioenergy, we have wind, and last but not least, we have hydropower. So I'm going to turn to each one of these associations, and what we've done is ask them to just do 2 slides to explain the state of the sector as it is at the moment and the impact that COVID has had, and then the second slide on what are the key messages to policymakers, echoing what we've heard, that so much of this now lies with governments. And I hope that at the end of this will form the basis of a conversation with participants, with whom we now have over 200, but then draw together by the end of this call a more coherent set of policy messages from the collective renewables. May I turn first of all to Bharadwaj Kumamuru, who is at the Executive Director of the Bioenergy Association. Bharadwaj.
Thanks, Eddie, for the for the initial talk, and also for the panelists for an excellent presentations. I just want to highlight that you've been doing excellent work as the chair of the REN Alliance, and we are very pleased to be a part of it. So firstly, my name is Bharadwaj Kumamuru, for anyone joining. I'm the Executive Director at the World Bioenergy Association, and I've been with this organization for about 6 years now. So WBA is basically a non-for-profit, non-governmental organization with a mission to promote the sustainable development of bioenergy on a global level. We've got a member base of about more than 250 members from more than 65 countries along the entire supply chain, including companies, associations, researchers, and so on. I thought I'll highlight just 3 main points in the talk and as a opinion from the bioenergy industry. Number one, briefly about bioenergy. Bioenergy still continues to be the largest renewable energy source globally in terms of the final energy consumption, I think with a share of about 13–14%. One of the key benefits of the technology is that it has a diverse range of feedstock, right from the forestry sector to agriculture to municipal waste to residues and so on. And at the same time, as you've seen highlighted by Rana and others on the importance of the focus on heating, bioenergy is one of the key solutions for decarbonizing all end-use sectors, including the electricity sector, but also heating, cooling, and transportation fuels. And also important to highlight, as we're talking about jobs, that this sector currently employs, I think, more than 3 million people with investments of more than $10 billion in the recent years. So it's a big sector with a big impact on the renewable energy industry. And the second point I wanted to highlight is that the COVID-19 pandemic has had an impact on bioenergy, similar to other technologies as well. But the thing to focus on is that the impact has been very dependent on the specific subsectors and also on because of the policies. For example, the sectors of solid biomass, for example, wood pellets, have been quite resilient in these times, mainly because they benefit from long-term agreements and long-term stable policies, whereas at the same time sectors such as liquid biofuels, we've seen a significant impact with closure of plants, with lowering of production, mainly because of the low oil price drop and the drop in transportation demand, as well as unstable policies. We've also, the survey we did based on which I'm reporting these impacts, companies have also reported that they see a significant impact on investments with companies putting investments on hold for a time being because of the uncertainty, and also reporting challenges for meeting revenue targets to the end of the year for companies. But the one important thing was to highlight in the impacts was we've seen there was a significantly less impact on employment, with very few companies reporting any layoffs or challenges right now. Next slide. So based on the survey we did, and we also gathered responses from the industry on what are the key messages they would like to see inform the policymakers, we've got 5 main key messages to inform. Number one is to recognize that bioenergy, along with other renewable energy technologies, have been providing clean, on-demand renewable energy in these times of crisis. And it's important to recognize that not just in these exceptional circumstances, but also moving ahead. The second point is that it's very important for policymakers to assure investors and the wider energy community of the support to renewables rather than fossil fuels. Say, for example, no new fossil fuel investments in coal or gas to prevent any lock-in effects, and that investments have to go towards renewable energy technologies. So that assurance from policymakers is important. The third point is that we've got to disincentivize the fossil fuel development. This is a perfect opportunity for the policymakers, not just because of the low oil prices, not just because of the low cost of renewable energy technologies, but also the broad public support we've been seeing for renewable energy. It's important for the policymakers to take this opportunity and take action in terms of either removing or reducing fossil fuel subsidies, implementing a price on carbon, or also developing national fossil exit strategies so as to ensure a level playing field. Fourth is to build back better with bioenergy. We've been hearing a lot about the recovery packages being implemented by countries around the world, and it's important that bioenergy and renewable energy technologies be a key central pillar in these packages. And finally, that it's time for ambition and action. We've heard the climate urgency being mentioned by Eddie, and also that 2020 was supposed to be the year of ambition. It's unfortunate that countries have not been submitting NDCs on time, and the COP has been delayed, unfortunately, but understandable. But it is a time also for countries to announce increased targets, increased mandates, and also to support renewable energy implementation. So those are the 5 key points, I think, as a message from the industry. Again, the contact details are there, and I'm glad to take questions at the end. Thanks, and I pass the mic back to Eddie.
Thank you, Bharadwaj. That was an excellent run through on bioenergy. Can I now turn quickly to Marit Brommer, who's the Executive Director at the International Geothermal Association. Marit.
Thank you, Eddie, and thank you all for joining this REN Alliance webinar. And it's an absolutely delight to speak here on behalf of the IGA, the International Geothermal Association. My name is Marit Brommer, and I am the Executive Director of the IGA. We are a New Zealandic-based organization, but we operate from Germany, and we have 64 countries in which we are active, dealing with geothermal energy, both for power, but also very much for the heating and cooling sector. Can I get the next slide, please? Thank you. We are very small when it comes down to the overall, let's say, percentage of adding renewable electricity in that mix. We have installed capacity of about 16 gigawatts, but all our power plants were active under the pandemic, staying at home regulations. We have seen no drop in power production, for which I am extremely proud, but also would like to congratulate all our technical staff throughout the world who are operating those power plants and have stayed on duty and were able to deal with the power generation on site. So a big thank you for that. We are small, but we provide an enormous, let's say, way to look after the independence and resilience infrastructure for both power, but definitely for heating and cooling. We are at the moment in a couple of countries very active when it comes down to heating and cooling. In Europe, we have a couple of projects in a couple of countries who are very favorable of allowing geothermal to look after their geothermal district heating critical infrastructures. But also China is setting their goals and their targets on geothermal for district heating purposes. It is obvious, though, that the potential for direct use of the geothermal resource hidden beneath our feet is going to be crucial when it comes down to allowing renewables to building back better after COVID-19. We are positioning geothermal very strongly in that low enthalpy and low energy, low temperature ranges, because we provide not only heating when it comes down to district heating, but we can also serve cooling. And in an ever heating climate, I think that's going to be quite crucial. So infrastructure is key, but also the fact that we are still playing a very, let's say, minor role is not helping to push the policy and hence the regulatory framework around geothermal and any type of renewable that wants to advance its percentage in that renewable energy mix when it comes down to heating and cooling projects. Because 23 countries, as Rana quite rightly said in the beginning of her presentation, 23 countries have policies on heating and cooling, and that clearly needs to go. So next slide, please. So we call very much, of course, on the government and on political leadership to look after policies and to look after regulatory frameworks that will help advance that heating and cooling directives into building back stronger and more sustainably in the coming years to come. But I would also like to call here to my own industry and, let's say, the complementary technologies that we very much see with our end use and our customers. For instance, with solar, we work very nice together when it comes down, for instance, to the green technology sector, the greenhouses, food. And let's say COVID-19 has learned us how dependent we are on that global market. And food, with the emphasis on not only organically grown and sustainably grown food close to your home, so the local to local approach. You look after greenhouse technology, greenhouse operators who have a clear demand for clean power, but also have a clear demand for having a constant temperature in their greenhouses. Geothermal being a baseload supplier of a constant service when it comes down to heating and keeping the temperature in the greenhouses to a certain degree, complemented with solar for clean electricity. I think it's a golden win for, let's say, sustainable food for a local to local approach. But also I call for an industry that comes together when it comes down to losing jobs in the fossil fuel sector. I'm very well aware of that we want to build back stronger in the green coalition. But I also call for not getting rid of all the fossil fuel staff who are looking after rigs and drills and site of producing assets for which those elementary capabilities and capacities are needed as well for geothermal. So a strong coalition for building back stronger, a just transition, where we can see that we can phase out one end and build it back into that subservice value proposition of both providing clean power and clean direct use of geothermal would be for all our industry leaders a big win-win. Thank you very much, and back to Eddie.
Thank you, Marit. Thanks. Excellent. Let me move swiftly on to Cristina Diaz, from the International Hydropower Association. Cristina.
Hi. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Eddie. And it's a pleasure for me to be here on behalf of the International Hydropower Association and be part of this webinar and also be part of REN Alliance. So I would like to start just providing some general context. So the clean electricity generation from hydropower achieved a record of 4,306 terawatt-hour in 2019. That represents almost 60% of the total renewables electricity production. That means that if hydropower was replaced by coal, we would have emitted an additional 4 billion tons of carbon dioxide last year. The total global hydropower installed capacity reached 1,308 gigawatts. That represents an annual rise of 1.2%. Yet, to reach the 2050 targets, the yearly average growth in hydropower capacity would need to reach an estimate of 2%. And this underlines that the need for investment in hydropower will need to increase significantly over the next decade and more. And this is because, if done right, hydropower's flexibility will be fundamental to achieve this green transition. There are research that indicate that solar and wind energy combined with storage are already today cheaper alternatives to fossil fuels. And there is where hydropower can play a significant role. It contributes to the system resilience and reliability through supporting services. And pumped storage, we cannot forget that it's the largest grid-scale energy storage application and can absorb the surplus energy in the system and release it exactly when it's needed. Also, hydropower provides multiple services. It can help to mitigate the impact of droughts and floods, as well as regulate flows to ensure the supply for industry, agricultural, domestic uses. And these additional services and the flexibility of hydropower have been even more latent during the COVID-19 crisis, underlying the hydropower sector resilience and its critical role in delivering clean, reliable, and affordable energy, especially at times of crisis. Sorry, next slide. So this has been reflected in the IHA position paper that can be accessed through our website and sets out the immediate impacts of the crisis on the hydropower sector and outlines important hydropower specific recommendations that we wanted to bring in today to take into account for the economic recovery plans that include the support of sustainable hydropower development as an essential part of the energy transition and wider development strategy, fast-track planning approvals where possible to ensure that the development starts as soon as possible, also provide financial support and allow the extension of construction deadlines if needed. And very important to work in collaboration with regulators and system operators to develop appropriate compensation mechanisms that recognize the services that hydropower provides. And last but not least, and most important, and the main reason why we're here today is to increase the ambition of renewable energy and climate targets. Thank you. Over to you, Eddie.
Thanks, Cristina. Excellent. Let's move on to Dave Rennie from the Solar former president of the International Solar Energy Society. Over to you, Dave.
Thank you very much, Eddie, and welcome everybody. Just to highlight, ISIS is a membership-based organization which focuses on promoting research and innovation in all solar energy technologies and their applications. We have a vision of a fully 100% renewable energy system for the world, used wisely and efficiently. So if you could go to the next slide, please. As you've already seen from Rana's presentation, solar electricity markets, by which I mean solar photovoltaics and concentrating solar power, have continued to grow dramatically over the past decades, so that today roughly 3% of the world's electricity supply comes from these technologies. And a big driver for this growth that we are seeing in solar PV capacity is a dramatic drop in their levelized cost of energy, which is approaching 5 cents per kilowatt hour, making them very competitive with all other electric power capacity options. However, it's important to note that solar technologies for non-electricity applications, such as solar heating for buildings, solar water heating, solar assisted district heating, and both high and low temperature heat for industrial processes, as well as other non-electric cooling applications, has also grown significantly. And even as our share of energy use that is coming from the electricity sector is increasing, these other solar technology applications are critically important, since decarbonizing the heating and cooling in the transport sectors remains especially challenging, as you've already seen from previous presentations. But with respect to the solar PV industry, because the COVID-19 impacts affect both the supply side, such as solar panel manufacturing, as well as the demand side, such as demand for rooftop systems and the availability of components that complete projects, our current estimates are that solar PV capacity expansion will decrease by roughly 10% this year from the expected growth we had anticipated back in 2019. However, many projects will simply only be delayed until 2021 rather than canceled. So we do expect that over the longer term, say over the next 3 to 5 years, there'll be the impact will be much less, and markets and capacity expansion could essentially be back to the 2019 projections by 2024. So the key messages from the solar industry to policymakers is that solar technologies are clearly cost competitive with traditional means of providing both electricity and heat, and these technologies also produce well-paying jobs and sustainable local economies, since expensive energy supplies do not need to be imported from elsewhere. And we can expect up to 30 million jobs in the solar PV sector alone by the year 2030. So the next slide, what I'm trying to do here is showing the potential contribution of solar technologies to achieving a fully decarbonized energy system by mid-century by highlighting the results of 3 recent studies that have explored pathways to achieve 100% renewable energy in all end-use sectors by the middle of this century. First and foremost, I need to note that these studies clearly show how all the technologies we are talking about today can logically work together to achieve such a target. And this is one of the key messages coming out of the RIN Alliance. But even just by looking at the contribution from solar PV, each of these studies, one is by ARENA, one is by the University of Sydney, and the third one is by the Energy Watch Group, or LUT. Each of these studies show that a 100% renewable energy target creates substantial markets for all technologies, especially including solar PV, since total installed capacities will be in the multi-terawatt range for solar PV, well above today's level of around 2/3 of a terawatt. And if we consider a pathway where nearly all of our end-use energy, including heat and transport, comes from electricity generating sources such as what the LUT study assumes, solar PV capacity will be in the tens of thousands of terawatts. And nevertheless, this variable renewable energy source will work well in a fully integrated renewable energy system consisting of all of our technologies. And these studies emphasize the point that by making effective policy decisions in response to COVID-19 today, we can be well on our way to addressing the looming climate mitigation crisis that we are facing for the future. Thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Eddie.
Thank you, Dave. That's excellent. Let me now turn to our final panelist, to Stefan Sangha, who is the Secretary General at the World Wind Energy Association. Stefan.
Yes, thank you very much, Eddie, and yeah, welcome to everyone. It's indeed a great pleasure being with all of you, with the REN Alliance partners, with all the renewable technologies, with our friends from IEA, IRENA, REN21, and to have also quite many people here who are participating. Thanks to everyone who contributed to this, and particularly the IJ team. I think we have a very interesting webinar here. Now let me, if you go please to the next slide, explain you a little bit the wind power situation. Wind power, of course, is one of the growth technologies worldwide. We have now a share of around 6% of the global electricity demand. In some countries, it's 40% or more. This is provided by around 650 gigawatt of installed wind capacity. Still, the sector is growing, or used to grow quite substantially, with growth rates, annual growth rates of about 10%. And of course, the potential, the wind potential worldwide is, it's not as big as solar, but it would be enough to cover the human energy needs. That's not what we're proposing, but there is no scarcity of wind. There's no lack of wind resources. What we see in the case of wind power, of course, it's in particular important that the people where the wind farms are, that they are involved in the projects, because wind has hardly any negative actual physical impacts on environment and on like doesn't create pollution, etc. But the people have to look at the wind turbines, and they need to like also the turbines. So let me have a brief give you a brief explanation of the impact of COVID-19. What we hear from our members is that there are problems. We cannot quantify them yet, but what we see, of course, is on the one hand that supply chains are interrupted, in particular international supply chains. Secondly, of course, also workforce is not fully available, because many countries still people have to stay at home. So we expect that in the short term, new installations will go down indeed. But in the midterm, I think that is similar to what we heard from our colleagues. As there will be now stronger emphasis on sustainability, on resilience, we expect that that will strengthen the sector. So we cannot at the moment predict when that will happen exactly, but I think the longer term prospects are again bright. So if I may ask for the next slide, please. So what we find in particular important, of course, this is kind of the general message we would have told you also before the COVID-19 crisis. Scale up massively wind power deployment rates. That's also important to really achieve the Paris targets. That can only be achieved when renewable energy in the foreseeable future reaches close to 100% of the energy supply worldwide. What is now, I think, new, and from our side, we have always focused on that. It's, I think, really important that there is a stronger focus on domestic, on national, on local solutions. Many governments now have understood that their societies, their countries are quite vulnerable because of dependence, and whether we like that or not, that's not so much a matter of how you rate that. There will be a stronger focus on strengthening local industries, domestic industries, and of course, energy is key to all the activities that we are doing. So what we expect, we also suggest, is of course strong focus on local supply chains, on domestic supply chains, as well as on local investors. That's also important with regard to the importance of the socioeconomic activities, also related to the acceptance of wind turbines that we see. So we should certainly now focus on opening the arena, opening the markets for everybody who can participate, who wants to participate. We see in particular in wind energy the importance of, for example, community wind. We have a special focus working on that. So we need the right policies now, not auctions which just allow a few international big companies to invest, but strengthen local investments. We of course also need to now make sure that wind farms can actually be built. That sometimes takes just too long. It takes sometimes years to get a building permission, and I think that can be certainly accelerated. Wind can provide a lot, but wind cannot stand alone. I mean, one message of our webinar here is renewables have to stand together. We have to work together to get the maximum benefits out of that. So governments now really have to start developing 100% renewable energy concepts. Political frameworks must be right. The technology must be also used, incentivized. We have new technologies that are not yet applied on a large scale. So that really now let's start using this opportunity. Wind will play a role, can play a role, must be allowed to play a role next to all the other technologies. But now we need the way free for such renewable energy approaches. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. Thanks to all the speakers for keeping to time. We're exactly on 1 hour. We've got 15 minutes left. That's going to be extremely challenging. You might have to forgive us if we go over by 5 or 10 minutes. We've had a whole set of very strong presentations, very clear in terms of what's happening at the moment and what our call to government and policymakers is. I've had a wide selection of questions and I'm not going to be able to satisfy you all by taking all of them. What I've tried to do is try to look at questions which are of global nature and try to be not technology specific and to look a bit more at policy issues rather than technical issues. Look, I'm going to try and see if we can get a question into everybody within the next 15 minutes. In that spirit, Rana, can I turn to you first of all and ask you, we got this question from Margaret Krieger, who says, how do you start a policy dialogue as an NGO? How does an NGO go about having a dialogue with policymakers and key decision makers and national governments?
Thank you. Yeah. That's an interesting question, and I think from Renton one side, it's important to say we do have an NGO legal status, but we're really multi-stakeholder network and community, which means that governments and intergovernmental organizations are also part of Renton One. And as a result, we always speak about the fact that this multi-stakeholder and various perspectives is more messy, but ultimately stronger, because we can already bring basically players from NGOs, industry, governments to the table. How are we doing this? Our entry point, I think there are probably 3 pillars. One is knowledge, information, fact. The other one is to inform and influence debate. And here we're the co-convener of the International Renewable Energy Conference, which is basically a multi-stakeholder policy dialogue. So here it's really at a very high level. It's about communication, but it's also about participating at the development of renewable energy data, which is kind of the translator, I guess, or a bridging tool between these different players. And so we are producing the global status report, but also regional status reports. And these are very often a very good opportunity to bring basically the different stakeholders around the table to agree on what the status is and create kind of prepare the field for policy dialogues, regulatory frameworks, project developments, which are then obviously not done by Renton One, but rather by national players. And what we are doing more is now to work also with our national, not counterparts, but community members, I guess, to see how we can translate the meta-narrative from the global level into a regional and national discussions, but also policies and regulatory frameworks. So as an example, I think very clearly what we are known for now is to say like, okay, energy is not power, or power is not energy. It's not the same thing. And to have such discussion, obviously, in Asia is a bit different than having it in Europe. And that is something where we're discussing, raising the awareness here and showing that solutions do exist.
Thanks for that, Rana. Okay, let me move on. Perhaps Roland. There have been quite a few questions to you, but from Catherine Bassett, she wants to know how will the decrease in the growth of the renewable energy installed capacity that you talked about, the sort of interruption in the growth in 2020, impact the chances of returning to the pathway that we need to be on? Do you see a big problem in the slowdown of growth of installed capacity in 2020?
Sorry, I'm not sure if I understood acoustically the question. Can you precisely repeat again? Sorry.
So from Catherine Bassett, she's taken note of the decrease in the growth of installed capacity from the renewables that has taken place over this year and last. And she's wondering, does that have a longer term impact on the chances to meet the Paris targets?
No, of course we are in a special situation. So renewables are now, most renewables are fully competitive to conventional fossil fuels and nuclear. And of course 2019 was in a way a special year, also now 2020 with the COVID crisis. But we expect that, let's say, the policy setup of the countries and also the competitiveness of renewable energy will bring an increase of the renewable energy investments in the past years and in the coming years. And we also see that now some countries already have taken action to put kind of COVID recovery packages together to invest further in renewables. So there will clearly be a further increase of renewables in the coming years.
Thank you. Can I ask Paolo to start off with on, there's a really interesting set of questions, particularly from Dean Cooper, about affordability. And has IEA done any analysis of the affordability for target populations of increasing renewable energy as a sort of end users? What kind of different mechanisms will be needed to help the end user in target populations?
Well, all our scenario analysis makes an economic assessment of the overall system. So of renewables, but also of the alternatives, and on top of that, of the system costs. Now, I would say what is true is that renewables are getting the cheapest sources of electricity supply. In other end-use sectors, they are still rather expensive. And so the results of our long-term scenarios are precisely, if you wish, an analysis of economic optimization. Now, in terms of affordability for a given country, that could be, of course, more, or a given sectors of the population. This is something that we partly do, but not in super detail. For instance, we publish also in our World Energy Outlook, we have the impact on electricity prices in the future, both for industrial client and residential clients. So in that sense, we see per macro region what are the impacts. I'm not sure this answers completely the question. Of course, at an affordability at country level would need a more detailed analysis.
Thank you, Paolo. Let me turn Barwaj on a set of questions that we have here around the scope for turning waste into energy applications, and what scope is there to increase the particularly waste part of bioenergy.
Yeah, I mean, if in the in the presentation, when I've mentioned the diverse range of feedstock, and I mentioned about if we focus only on the municipal solid waste, right now the share is quite low compared to the forestry sector or the agriculture sector. It's about 3%, but then there's still significantly a lot more potential to increase the use of municipal waste to produce energy because of increasing population in cities and the need for supplying affordable, cleaner energy for population living in urban areas. But if I look at the waste and residues from, say, forestry and agriculture sector, the technical potential itself is quite huge. But I think there was already a lot of developments happening. For example, in the forestry sector, if I look at the total sector in a whole, most of the energy which comes from the forestry comes mainly from the residues, mainly from harvesting or processing of forestry products right now. There's still a lot more to be used in different regions around the world. The same thing goes with the agriculture sector. Whereas the implementation of waste in the agriculture is quite low compared to the implementation of the waste in the forestry sector, but there are already various case studies, both, for example, in China and India, where countries are looking at ways in which they can utilize straw, husk, and other agricultural waste, either to co-fire it with coal-based power plants, but also to produce process biomass and then use that to produce energy. So there's a lot of examples. There's a lot of potential as well. We've done some publications on that, and I'd be happy to share with any of the participants who would like to know more.
Super, thank you. This is great. Marit, let me turn to you. We've got some interesting questions that we in Hydropower are always asking ourselves. Francesca Antonelli from WWF is asking about fast tracking. So here we are, we've all been saying, hey, governments, you need to try to fast track some of these applications and support the business, but how do we make sure that there are strong environmental, social safeguards in place? I know that's something you're beginning to look at in the geothermal sector.
Yeah, very much. And I think this has to do with let's say, the overarching principles of the Sustainable Development Goals and how we monitor and measure our operations in the entire supply chain, but also the assets that we manage. And I think this is a very valid question, and something that we all feel very strong towards having those implementations on the ground, those measurements, those protocols, and those regulations. So the one does not exclude the other. We are working together also very much with the IHA in terms of setting those goals and having those let's say, sustainability assessment protocols that can help us to identify the status, to set the baseline, and to understand where it has or may have a potential impact on the environment. So far, I think there is always a risk when you manage an asset that is producing a fluid from the subsurface in whatever capacity and to whatever purpose. But I think we have a good handle on what it is that we need to do in order to mitigate those risks. And another thing that I feel very strong about is our social license to operate. We have a very strong communication strategy in all our projects across the world. We have strong stakeholder analysis very well in advance when we do project analysis and when we want to develop projects, with local stakeholders involved, with the people who are living, you know, at and nearby our premises, and who are often always gain something as well from the local entity. But valid question, and I think something to very much take into consideration when we're fast tracking geothermal into the future. Thank you.
Super, thank you, Marit. Let me turn to Christina. I mean, that sustainability question is one we face a lot, and I'm glad Marit's referred to the sustainability assessments and protocol and standards that we've had in place. Let me ask you a slightly different angle. Eugene Simonov has been asking about weather-dependent renewables and whether or not we have systems to ensure climate resilience in our plans, and also about ensuring that we can measure or know the methane emissions from reservoirs.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So yeah, when we talk about, it's clear that we're moving towards more weather-dependent renewables, and there hydropower plays a key role to provide flexibility and storage done in the correct way. We understand that climate change can also be a threat to hydropower assets, while at the same time it can help prevent floods and droughts. For that, in 2019, we launched the Climate Resilience Guide. It's available in our website to download and to follow that guide to assess projects, to assess the resilience of a project. So in that way, a plan can be able to assess how resilient and improve the resilience, but also on the side of climate adaptation to provide additional systemic resilience, and that links very much to the increase of variable renewables in the energy matrix. And the second question was more related to the emissions. So in terms of the emissions, that has been a broadly discussed subject in terms of what are the, how much are the emissions, how much is emitted from a reservoir. And so from our side, looking at hydropower reservoirs, as well as any kind of reservoir, we developed together with universities the GRS tool that helps calculate, assess the greenhouse gas emissions of a reservoir, taking into account what was so pre and post impoundment to really take into account what is the emissions of the specific asset, the reservoir, and how much is allocated to the different uses of the reservoir.
Thank you, Christina. And David, can I look to you and ask you a set of questions come in about floating solar, and just some insights from you about what kind of potential you see for this. Is this really in volume terms, a sizable example of renewables working together?
Yes, so thank you. That's a very interesting question. And in fact, ICES just held a webinar with the Global Solar Council on that very topic a few weeks ago. And so I would encourage listeners to look up that webinar if they can. I think they could find the link to it on the ICES website or the Global Solar Council website. But yes, floating solar is becoming a growing interest with the solar community because it provides access to surface areas that which can become in short supply especially for central generation PV solar power plants. Land use can become quite challenging for finding sites for solar systems. So putting solar on reservoirs or bodies of water is having growing interest. There are certainly some advantages to that. For example, the cooling effects of the water improve the efficiency of solar over what would normally you would find on hot weather, for example, on land. There may be some actual benefits to the reservoirs in terms of reducing evaporation. And I think the challenges, of course, are going to be with the movement of the solar panels and designing systems that can withstand constant motion from the waves that one might expect on floating solar. But I think that this is a technology that's certainly growing. There are companies that are actively investing in these projects and installing systems, especially in Southeast Asia and other countries as well.
Thanks, Dave.
So thank you.
Okay, and finally, let me turn to Stefan. Just a general question which came through to people, all the panelists, really, but it's just to you, if I may. This whole question of global awareness. How can we build this is something that wind has done very well, the awareness of wind energy as a source of energy, but how about across all the renewables? Is there much more that we can do to get people to recognise the we renewables work together? We're not just a set of individual sectors.
Yeah, well, I think the main point, if we talk about not just the experts, but the people all over the world, is, I mean, this is saying seeing is believing. I think it is very important to show the example where it works. Now, much more than ever before, showing cases which show not just one technology. It's still nice, of course, for me to see a wind farm, but it's, of course, much more fascinating to see a village which has maybe a small hydro plant and then a wind farm and some solar and there's some bioenergy. Refer to such cases and show that that is working, that it's affordable, that it supplies additional benefits, not only the power, but people can also generate income. I think these examples and all the benefits around that, we must now talk much more about that than about, let's say, efficiency gains of the turbine or a solar panel, where we have now 2% more. This is, of course, a discussion that is also important, but when you think about cars, are totally different from when a car was invented in 1885, I think it was the first time. The people are now not anymore understanding car technology, but the way cars are presented, of course, also makes them attractive. Everybody understands how to use them, and everybody now knows that you want to have certain features that allow you to do certain things. And that is, I think, something that we need also to do in the renewable energy sector. Show people how they benefit and how they can be part of it. I think that's also very important, because they can be active part of the energy sector, different from the past.
That's a very inspiring message to finish the panel discussion with. Thank you very much, Stefan. Thanks to all the panelists. Look, before we have overrun slightly, but if I can just ask you to indulge us just for another 2 or 3 minutes. I just want to bring up the next slide, where we've tried to bring together the messages that we've heard from all the different panelists today and in some of the answers. And this is hopefully going to be the sort of the takeaway from this that we maybe will put up as some kind of statement. But as a renewable voice for a unified voice for renewables, how are we going to get to 100% decarbonisation? We see there seem to be the consistent messages coming across: the need to accelerate deployment of renewables across all of these sectors of heating, cooling and transport, and also looking at better opportunities to connect those sectors. Secondly, this whole aspect of financial incentives is coming through very strongly, how to create a competitive advantage for end users and self-suppliers in power. Thirdly, the move to fiscal mechanisms that recognise and value not just the lowest price for energy, but what are the additional benefits? What are the things that renewables offer just beyond just the lowest or just price of delivery? And that needs to be better designed, embedded into market mechanisms. Fourthly, of course, the broader policy framework that we've been talking about for an inclusive energy transition. This is part of national development. It needs to focus on energy deployment, on enabling and integrating policies that allow for a full variety of the investors, all the way from individuals to large companies. Fifthly, of course, a focus by governments on green skills and also the companies themselves to make sure that people are well trained up to take up the jobs in the renewable sector. And finally, how do we make sure that we map and promote the health benefits of a green energy-based economy. Let me just, if you can go on to the next slide, let me just remind all participants of the renewable status reports that you've heard reference to today from REN21, from IEA, from IRENA, from IHA, from others, from ISIS. So there they are. One other slide, just to show you, next slide please, the statements that have been put out by various organizations represented today, Bioenergy, Hydropower, IRENA, IEA, REN21, on looking forward to green recovery and the position papers. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time. I'm sorry that we've gone over slightly. We've covered a huge amount of terrain in a short period of time. I hope that you can take with you that general message that the renewables are saying to you right now: we are united, we are complementary, we are bigger than the sum of our parts. Thank you. We will be in touch soon with another one of these events. Thank you.